In the hills of ancient Israel, a farmer needed to sharpen his plow. To do it, he had to leave his village, walk down out of the mountains, cross into enemy territory, and pay a foreign people for the privilege of sharpening his own tool. He had no choice, because in all the land of Israel, there was not a single blacksmith. Not one. And that was not an accident. That was policy. This is the story of the most bitter rivalry in the Old Testament, two nations that arrived in the same land at almost the same moment and spent 200 years trying to destroy each other. This is why the Philistines hated Israel. Who were the Philistines? We tend to picture the Philistines as generic villains, brutes, giants, the people Samson fought and David humiliated. The truth is far more interesting and far more uncomfortable. The Philistines were not natives of Canaan. They were immigrants, refugees, in fact. Around the year 1177 BC, the entire eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. Within roughly one generation, the great empires that had ruled the region for centuries simply fell apart. The Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean Greece burned. Cities that had stood for 500 years were abandoned and never reoccupied. And out of that collapse came waves of displaced people the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. We know this because Pharaoh Ramesses III carved it into a wall. At his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, there are reliefs showing a massive naval battle against invaders. The carvings show warriors with distinctive tall headdresses, feathered or reed crowns, fighting from ships, with ox carts carrying their women and children behind them. These were not raiders. These were entire populations on the move. Ramesses claimed victory, and among the peoples he named, one group appears as the Peliset, the Philistines. They did not go home because there was no home to go back to. They settled on the southern coastal plain of Canaan, and they stayed. For a long time, all of this rested on Egyptian texts and biblical references. Then, in 2019, archaeologists working at Ashkelon published DNA analysis from a small cemetery of infant burials dating to the early Iron Age. The results showed a genetic signature with clear Southern European ancestry, appearing suddenly in the population and then diluting away over the following generations as the newcomers intermarried with the local population. The archaeology says the same thing. The earliest Philistine sites are full of Aegean-style pottery, central hearths in the middle of rooms, which is a Greek architectural habit, not a Canaanite one. Cylindrical, unbaked loom weights of a type found in the Aegean world. Even their earliest names are not Semitic. So here is the picture. A displaced, technologically advanced Aegean-descended people arrive on the coast of Canaan around 1175 BC and build themselves a new nation. And at almost exactly the same moment in the hills just east of them, another people is consolidating its own identity. Israel. Two new nations, one small land. Same century, the collision was almost mathematical. The land problem. Open a map of ancient Canaan, and the first cause of the hatred becomes obvious. The Philistines took the coast. Israel got the hills. That sounds like a minor detail. It was not. It was everything. The Philistines organized themselves into 5 city-states, what scholars call the Pentapolis: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Each was ruled by a lord, and the 5 acted together in war. Not a kingdom exactly, a confederation, and a very effective one. Those cities sat on the best agricultural land in the region: flat, fertile coastal plain with reliable rainfall, grain country, vineyards, olive presses. Ekron would later become one of the largest olive oil production centers in the entire ancient Near East. with over 100 industrial oil presses. But the land was not even the main prize. Running straight through Philistine territory was the most important road in the ancient world. The Egyptians called it the Way of Horus. Later generations knew it as the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea. It was the artery connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia. Every caravan, every army, every trade shipment between the two great civilizations of the ancient world passed through that corridor. Whoever controlled that road controlled the wealth of the region. The Philistines controlled it. Israel, meanwhile, was in the central highlands. Rocky terrain, terraced farming carved out of hillsides by hand. Thinner soil, less rain, no ports, no highway, no access to the sea. Now, this is the crucial point most retellings miss. The hatred did not flow in one direction. It was mutual, and each side had a rational grievance. From Israel's side, we were promised this land, and these foreigners are sitting on the best part of it. From the Philistine side, we lost everything. Our world burned. We fought our way here and built 5 cities out of nothing. And now these hill tribes are multiplying, coming down into our valleys and claiming a God gave them our territory. Neither side was going to move. And that brings us to the second reason, the one that made the Philistines genuinely terrifying. The iron monopoly. There is a passage in 1 Samuel chapter 13 that is easy to read past. It is one of the most revealing verses in the entire Old Testament. The text says that there was no blacksmith to be found in all the land of Israel. The Philistines had made sure of it. So the Israelites had to go down to the Philistines to sharpen their plowshares, their mattocks, their axes, their sickles. And when the day of battle came, the text says that among all the people, only Saul and his son Jonathan had a sword or a spear. Think about what that describes. An entire nation going to war, and 2 men are properly armed, the king and his son. This was not poverty. This was deliberate strategic control. The Philistines arrived in Canaan at precisely the moment the region was transitioning from bronze to iron, and they held the metalworking knowledge. Whether they invented it or simply carried it with them from the Aegean world, they controlled it, and they made absolutely certain their neighbors in the hills did not get it. No blacksmiths meant no swords, no spears, no armor. And it meant something worse, total economic dependence. Every farmer in Israel had to physically walk into Philistine-held territory and pay Philistine prices just to keep his farming tools working. Every season. Forever. There is a detail in that passage that archaeology later confirmed in a remarkable way. The text lists the prices charged for sharpening, and it uses a unit of measurement. A pim. For centuries, translators had no idea what a pim was. It appears nowhere else. Some assumed the text was corrupted. Then, in the early 20th century, excavators started pulling small stone weights out of Iron Age sites in Israel, inscribed with 3 Hebrew letters, P-Y-M. A pim. A real weight unit, roughly 2/3 of a shekel, that went out of use before the Old Testament was ever compiled, which means whoever wrote that passage knew a price system that had already been dead for centuries. Now, put yourself in the sandals of an Israelite farmer. Every time your blade dulls, you walk into the territory of the people who kill your relatives, and you hand them silver so they will let you keep farming. That is not a rivalry. That is humiliation with a receipt. Dagon and the Ark. The third reason the hatred ran so deep is the one that mattered most to both sides. This was a religious war. The chief god of the Philistines was Dagon. Temples to Dagon stood in Gaza and in Ashdod. He was a grain and fertility deity, absorbed from the older Semitic populations of the region, and by the time the Philistines settled in, they had adopted him as their own. And in the ancient world, war between nations was understood as war between gods. When your army won, your god had won. When your army lost, your god had been defeated, which is exactly what makes the story in 1 Samuel chapters 4 through 6 so devastating for both sides. Israel goes out to fight the Philistines at Aphek and loses badly. So the elders make a decision. Bring the Ark of the Covenant down from Shiloh onto the battlefield. Carry the presence of God into the fight, and victory is guaranteed. The Ark arrives. The Israelite camp erupts in a shout so loud the Philistines hear it and are gripped with terror. The text says they cried out that a god had come into the camp, and then Israel loses anyway, catastrophically. 30,000 foot soldiers dead, the 2 sons of Eli killed, and the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object in Israel, captured and carried away. For the Philistines, this was total theological victory. They had not just beaten Israel's army, they had beaten Israel's God, and they had the trophy to prove it. So they took the ark to Ashdod and set it in the temple of Dagon, at the feet of their god. The standard practice of the ancient world, the defeated deity placed in submission before the victor. The next morning, the priests opened the temple. Dagon was face down on the ground before the ark. They set the statue back up. The following morning, they came again, and Dagon was down once more, and this time the head and both hands had broken off on the threshold. What follows is one of the strangest sequences in Scripture. A plague breaks out in Ashdod. They send the ark to Gath. The plague follows. They send it to Ekron, and the people of Ekron beg them to stop. After 7 months, the Philistine lords consult their own priests and diviners, who tell them to send the thing back, and to send a guilt offering with it. Golden models of the tumors and golden mice, one for each of the 5 cities. They load the ark on a new cart, hitch it to 2 milk cows that have never been yoked, take their calves away from them, and let it go. As a test, if the cows leave their calves and walk straight up the road toward Israelite territory, they will know. The cows walked straight up the road, lowing as they went and never turned. Understand what that means for the relationship between these two peoples. The Philistines had won the war and lost the argument. They had captured Israel's God and been forced to send him home with an apology gift. You do not forget a humiliation like that. Neither side did. The culture clash beyond land, beyond weapons, beyond theology, there was something simpler and more visceral. These two peoples found each other disgusting. 2 things in particular. The pigs. This is one of the clearest signals in the archaeology. When excavators sift through the animal bones at Philistine sites in the early Iron Age, pig bones show up in significant quantities. In some layers, a substantial share of the meat diet. When they sift through the highland Israelite settlements from the same period, pig bones are almost entirely absent. Same region, same century. 2 populations sitting a few dozen kilometers apart, and one of them is eating an animal the other considers ritually unclean. Diet is identity. It was then, and it is now. Every meal in a Philistine city was, from an Israelite point of view, a visible declaration of foreignness. And circumcision. The Philistines did not practice it. Nearly every other people in the region did. Egyptians, Edomites, Ammonites, Moabites. The Philistines came from a different world and kept a different custom, which is why the Bible almost never calls them simply the Philistines in moments of contempt. It calls them the uncircumcised. It becomes their epithet. It is the word Jonathan uses. It is the word Saul uses. It is the word a teenage David throws at Goliath in the Valley of Elah when he asks who this uncircumcised Philistine is that he should defy the armies of the living God. That was not a random insult. It was the whole conflict compressed into a single word. You are not one of us. You are not in covenant, and you do not belong here. The cycle of blood. By the time we reached the era of the judges, the hatred was no longer about policy. It was personal, and it was generational. Every family on both sides had someone to bury. Samson, a chaotic, tragic figure whose entire life is entangled with the Philistines. Marriage, betrayal, revenge, escalation. He burns their fields. They burn his wife's family. He kills 1,000 of them. They blind him and chain him to a mill. It ends with him pulling down the temple of Dagon at Gaza on a festival crowd. Read as history rather than legend. The Samson cycle is the record of a low-intensity border war that never stopped for a generation. Shiloh. After the disaster at Aphek, Israel's central sanctuary at Shiloh, where the ark had been kept, the religious heart of the nation, disappears from the story entirely. Archaeologists digging at the site found a destruction layer dated to roughly that period. Centuries later, the prophet Jeremiah would tell the people of Jerusalem to go and look at what God allowed to happen to Shiloh as a warning. The memory was still raw. Gilboa, the lowest point. Saul, Israel's first king, is defeated on Mount Gilboa. 3 of his sons die, including Jonathan. Saul, badly wounded, takes his own life rather than be captured. The next day, the Philistines find the bodies. They cut off Saul's head. They strip his armor and put it in the temple of Ashtaroth. According to Chronicles, they fasten his head in the temple of Dagon, and they nail the bodies of the king of Israel and his sons to the wall of Beth-Shan for public display. It was the men of Jabesh-Gilead, a town Saul had rescued at the very beginning of his reign, who marched all night, took the bodies down off that wall, and gave them a burial. That is where the hatred lived, not in a treaty dispute, on a wall in Beth-Shan. The irony of David. And here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, the part most tellings leave out entirely. David, the boy who killed Goliath of Gath, later went and lived in Gath. When Saul's pursuit became unbearable, David fled across the border and offered his services to Achish, the Philistine king of Gath. He served as a vassal warlord. Achish gave him the town of Ziklag as a base. He lived among the Philistines for roughly 16 months, and he was so trusted that when the Philistines mustered for the campaign that would end at Gilboa, Achish brought David along and only pulled him from the line because the other Philistine lords did not trust him. The greatest enemy of the Philistines spent over a year as a Philistine client. And that name, Achish, has an interesting afterlife. In 1996, excavators at Tel Mikna, the site of ancient Ekron, uncovered a royal dedicatory inscription in a temple. It names the city as Ekron, lists 5 kings of a single dynasty, and identifies the builder as Ikausu, son of Padi. Ikausu is essentially the same name as Achish, and it is not Semitic in origin. It appears to trace back to a word meaning the Greek or the Achaean. There is another find worth mentioning. At Tel Es Safi, which is almost certainly the site of ancient Gath, archaeologists recovered a pottery fragment dated to roughly the 10th or 9th century BC, inscribed with 2 names of clearly non-Semitic Aegean-type form. Both are linguistically close relatives of the name Goliath. That does not prove Goliath existed. It does prove that at exactly the right period, in exactly the right city, people carried exactly that kind of name. When David finally became king, he did what neither the judges nor Saul could do. He broke Philistine power permanently. Not through some technological leap, but through unification and discipline. From that point on, the Philistines are still present, but they are never again the existential threat they had been. How it ended, and the final irony. So what happened to them? They assimilated, and then they were erased. By the 7th century BC, the archaeological record shows Philistine culture had largely dissolved into the surrounding world. They were writing in a Semitic script. Their kings had names drawn from local languages. Their gods were regional deities. The Aegean distinctiveness had faded almost completely. And then Babylon came. Around 604 BC, Nebuchadnezzar swept down the coast. Ashkelon was destroyed and burned. The population was deported. Babylonian administrative records from that period list rations issued to exiles identified as coming from Ashkelon and Gaza, some of the last documentary traces of Philistines anywhere. After that, they are gone, not conquered and absorbed. Gone as a people. But here is the final irony, and it is a good place to close. The Philistines lost every long war they ever fought. Their cities were burned, their gods forgotten, their language dead, their people scattered and dissolved. And yet the world never quite forgot them. If you take one thing from this history, let it be this. The Philistines had the coast, the road, the trade, the iron, the chariots, the fortified cities, and the giant. By every measurable standard of the ancient world, they should have won, and Israel should have vanished into the hill country like 100 other forgotten tribes. The Israelites went into battle with farm tools, and the story that survived, the story that shaped Western civilization, is not the Philistine story. It is the story of the people who had nothing but a covenant. There is a scene that captures the whole thing. 5 smooth stones from a brook against bronze armor and a spear like a weaver's beam. The advantage was never the equipment. If this kind of deep dive into biblical history is what you came for, subscribe. There is a lot more coming. And tell me in the comments which enemy of Israel you want covered next. The Amalekites, the Moabites, or Babylon itself.